ladies and gentlemen. First of all, can I just check, can you hear me? Is that all nice and clear? Yay, excellent. Well, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to the Royal Society of Edinburgh. My name is Jeremy Smith. I'm Professor of English Philology at Glasgow University. And it's my job to chair the proceedings today and stop people fighting on the stage. And that's essentially what I'm for. And there we go. But I'm also here to do one or two housekeeping things and one or two introductory things at the beginning before handing over to the President of the Philological Society, Professor Aditi Lahiri, who's going to say a few words after that. I should say one or two things. If you haven't been to the RSE before, a little bit about it. It's an educational charity. And registered in Scotland, and it does do various useful things, which range from supporting academic work to doing such work as outreach. And we're doing some quite exciting work at the moment in places like Inverness and Arbroath and the Borders and the Highlands, and it's all great. So people like me go around and annoy people in schools, which is rather a fun thing to do. But we've been around since 1783 and doing our business since then. And we've been in this building since 1909. We've had various presidents. His Grace the Duke of Buccleuch, I don't know if the Duke of Buccleuch nowadays is here with us this evening, but he was the founding president. But later ones include Sir Walter Scott and Lord Kelvin, who did it twice, which was rather jolly for him. But the most recent president, which is a great moment, was Dame Jocelyn Bell Burnell. And Jocelyn was the postgraduate student who discovered the first radio pulsars. And she's been the president, and she is the president at the moment. And I can't see her here, but she's fantastic, a really interesting person. And she's going to be succeeded by Dame Anne Glover, who takes over as a distinguished microbiologist and is known as the Chief Scientific Officer to the European Commission. So that's all very exciting. I'm also supposed to underline the fact that it's independent and non-party political. I should say that. And its job is to provide public benefits throughout Scotland. And there's about 1,600 of us who are fellows of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. Some of us are more distinguished than others, no doubt, and people like me are down amongst the dead men, but there we go. But there are quite a lot of us who do various things as part of the job. Now, the key thing I'm supposed to tell you is about evacuation procedures. So I was told this is the climax of my discussion, and we're not expecting a fire alarm. So if there is a fire alarm, it's the real thing. And you may observe the running male figures. That applies to women as well. I'm sorry, it's kind of, we should probably vary it. There's one there, and that shows where you're supposed to leave. If you choose to go out that way, you turn left. If you go that way, you go straight out. And the assembly place is outside the Dome pub, just along the way. So it means that, after the tension of escaping from the blazing building, you can go there. So that's it. There is a statement about what you're supposed to do. So you either exit by the rear of the theatre out into George Street and then right along George Street, or by the signed exit into the Rose Street Lane, so you're there. But you must not stop to pick up any of your belongings, however treasured they are. So that's very important. The lecture is going to be audio recorded. There'll be a summary lecture report which will appear on the RSE website in a couple of weeks' time, and there will be some photographs taken of the speakers during this event. So we'll be asking them to approve that that's okay. We don't want to choose, you may want to go through and choose some of the better ones. So that's kind of important. And the final really important thing I have to say is, yes, put your mobile phones on silent. If you haven't done that yet, do it now, and if you don't do it, despite my urging, I will come and look at you in a very fierce way. So there we go. And that's all I'm going to say. So I'd like now to introduce Professor Aditi Lahiri, Fellow of the British Academy, and also President of the Philological Society, and she is going to say a little bit about the Philological Society and about what she's on about. So Aditi, for you.
These podiums are definitely made for men. I wish they would at least go up and down, but they'd never do. This is a tripartite event, the Philological Society, the British Academy, and the Royal Society. Jeremy has told you a lot about the Royal Society. My job here is to tell you something about the Philological Society and the British Academy. I'm here only because I happen to be the current president of the Philological Society, and I'll be the vice president of the British Academy from July, and hence I'm supposed to be the expert, which I'm not. About 8 years ago, the British Academy and the Philological Society had decided to come together to do some symposia or lectures. And this year, we decided to have one on the variation of Scots, and, what other better place to do it than at the Royal Society of Edinburgh. So here we are. Now, the British Academy is very much like the Royal Society, except that the British Academy is the UK's national body of covering humanities and social sciences only. So the Royal Society of the UK covers, there has been a division of labour, and Jeremy and I were talking about it, and initially the Royal Society obviously covered all of these, just like the Royal Society of Edinburgh, but the humanities and social sciences were considered to have been a separate entity from the end of the 19th century. The Philological Society is the oldest learned body in the UK, focusing on philology and study of language and languages. And it's began sometime, like everything, it's unclear exactly when it was supposed to have begun, but somewhere around 1840, we understand that this body was formed. It has the transactions of the Philological Society, and of course, it also funds student research and so on and so forth. The British Academy, very much like the Royal Society of Edinburgh, also covers funding. It does all sorts of things, as Jeremy says, like funding research internationally, nationally, postdoctoral funding, and also plays a role in trying to talk to political about shaping political decisions wherever it concerns us. Now, in terms of this particular event, the section which is involved in the British Academy is the Linguistics and Philology, and you can see where it's going, Linguistics and Philology, and the Philological Society, and of course, many of colleagues over here, like Jeremy and Jennifer Smith, the professors, and Robert, are all linguistics professors. There's a lot of overlap between us. Some of us are members of all of them. Some of us are members of some of them. But in any event, all of us believe in language and languages. And I'm not going to bore you with any more of this, but hand you over to Jeremy, who will entertain us. Or he says he's not going to entertain us. He's going to just, have a whip ready so as that everybody else can do the entertaining. Thank you very much for coming, and I hope you have a lovely time.
Well, thank you very much indeed. We have 5 people who are going to do the work this evening, and they are all aligned along here on the podium with me. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say very briefly who each of them are, and then I'm going to introduce them to speak for 4 or 5 minutes, 3 or 4 minutes each, on about themselves, and to raise a couple of the key issues that they feel are important in studying variation in Scots. The persons we have are Bruce Eunson, who is at the far end there, who is Scots Language Coordinator for Education Scotland. There's Michael Hance, who's sitting next to me, who's the Director of the Scots Language Centre. There's Alice Heywood, who is there in the middle, and she's the Learning Officer for the National Library of Scotland. And there, sitting right in the sort of just a little bit further away from me, is Jennifer Smith from my own institution, who's Professor of Sociolinguistics at Glasgow, and Robert McColl Millar, who's Professor of Linguistics and Scottish Language in the University of Aberdeen. So there they go. So I'm going to do this very carefully, alphabetically, by surname. So Bruce, would you like to say a little bit about yourself and what your role is, and a little bit about what you think of the issues you want to discuss tonight?
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. So my name's Bruce Eunson. Cam here today for my home in Shetland, where I'm bed missed in my life, either is my years at Strathclyde University studying English. I work for Education Scotland as Scots Language Coordinator, travelling across the country promoting the use of Scots in education, everything from nursery and the youngest, the bairns at age 3, up to what's now called senior phase, and teenagers who are sitting exams. And then I also do work with different universities and adult learning organisations, including work in prisons where men and women who are serving time in there but are interested in further education. Before working for Education Scotland, this is my 5th year doing that, I used to do the same job but specifically in Shetland, so travelling around the Shetland Isles promoting the use of Shetland dialect. Now I promote all the different dialects, all the variations of Scots. And it's a great passion of mine, in both in my personal life and my working life. I write a lot of poetry in Shetland dialect. I also make films where the narration and the characters speak in Shetland dialect. And I'm very much convinced of the benefits that it has within literacy and the learning of languages. But something I'd be keen to hear from the rest of the panel and anyone else in the audience is whether or not it's in any way an issue that speakers in Shetland, Orkney, and particularly North East, don't refer to themselves as speakers of Scots language. That I would say about myself that I speak Shetland dialect, and an Orcadian would say about speaking Orcadian, and there's people who say about speaking Doric. So there's a lack of unity there in terms of how they view what it is that they speak, whether it's dialect or language. So I'd be interested to hear any thoughts and conversation about that.
Thank you very much, Bruce. Michael.
I've got a horrible scribbled bit of paper here, Jeremy, so I'll refer to it as I go through. So I'm Michael Hance, and I'm the director of the Scots Language Centre. And I don't have a background in language academically. I studied politics at the University of Edinburgh. I've been the director of Scots Language Centre for 16 years, so I've had a long period in this job now. So I've seen a lot of the changes that have taken place policy-wise and politically over these years, and also in terms of the provision of service in schools and elsewhere. I'm a member of the North East Scots Language Board, recently appointed. I was discussing this with Robert earlier on, and he said to me, I'll see you at the meeting on Tuesday then, but it turns out I'm at a lower level than he is. He's obviously at some very important level, and I'm not, but I'm on that board really because of being director of the centre, but also because I'm fae the North East. I'm an Aberdeen loon, and grew up in Aberdeen, although my mother she's still going strong. She's a Shetlander, so I spent a lot of time when I was a child staying with my family in Shetland because all our relatives lived there, and we were very fortunate to be there every summer for very long periods, and of course be exposed to Shetland dialect, and that was a tremendous learning experience. I've also been the secretary of the cross-party group on Scots at the Scottish Parliament, secretary and treasurer of the Lorimer Trust, and I was a member of the ministerial working group on Scots, and I'm also formerly the director of the Saltire Society. So I've been involved in many areas of Scottish culture for really most of my working life, at least since I left university. And I left when I was I went as a mature student, a slightly mature student. So I started all this stuff in my 30s, I guess. So my kind of interest in Scots this evening is there's two questions I want to raise. The reason Robert is in the superior position on the North East Scots Language Board and I'm in an inferior one is because when I told Robert earlier on what I was going to talk about tonight, he said, "Oh no, that's rubbish. You don't talk about that. don't talk about that, talk about this. So I said, no. I'm always a student, and never always listening carefully to what the professors have got to say. Well, I was a good student. I was, when you go when you're an older person, you take things differently. I mean, there's somebody in the audience tonight who I met on my first day at university, so it's quite funny. She's 30 odd years later. we're still here. So she knows what I was really like at university. So I can't lie really any longer. But the subject I was going to talk about, or I wanted to raise, was the realisation of Scots on social media. So that's how Scots appears on Facebook, Twitter, other social media platforms, and whether or not the existence of social media has been liberating for Scots speakers, how they find their voices on social media and how they realise those voices in written form, where you find it and where you don't find it. And because I'm not an academic or a researcher, I don't necessarily have a lot of evidence to hand to you in terms of how that works, but we can maybe discuss anecdotal examples of it. And then the other thing that Robert very sensibly told me that I should bring up is the question of the collection of data. The main way of collecting data about Scots up to now has been through the census. The mechanism has been the census going into everybody's home, and people having to ask themselves questions about, well, am I a Scots speaker, and what is a Scots speaker, and how does this affect me? And this data was collected in 2011 for the first time, and we're now getting close to the next census in 2021. And I guess what we've got to ask ourselves is, how do we want to collect that data? Do we want to keep the question the same? And how do we persuade people through the country? We had to do this the last time, that those Doric speakers, Shetland speakers, and Orcadians, that the question refers to them. So those are the two issues I think would be interesting to discuss.
Fantastic. Thanks, Michael. Next one is Alice.
Hello, I'm Alice Heywood. I'm one of the learning officers at the National Library of Scotland. And as you can tell by my accent, I'm fairly new to Scotland. My background is I did my undergrad in English Lit at the University of California at Berkeley. Moved to London, worked there as a web designer for 13 years. Moved up to Scotland, but I always had this love of literature, and moving up to Scotland exposed me to a whole range of literature. So I was fortunate enough to get the post at the National Library of Scotland. And basically my remit there is to expose the collections to as wide an audience as possible via digital platforms. And it's been my absolute pleasure and good luck that I have responsibility for Scots and Gaelic in that role. So it's just really, every day is a learning opportunity, and I want to try and kind of share that with everyone, that through a digital platform, but also by events such as this. So for me it's a really an eye-opening adventure every day to be able to just delve into these texts and just see the richness and the beauty that's there. And I suppose one of the things that I'd like to get from tonight is, particularly from my institution, is having a Gaelic language plan really has helped to embed practice for that delivery for all our Gaelic language material. And I'm just wondering if perhaps a Scots language policy would actually be beneficial for national institutions to take up, because I think we need buy-in from a kind of senior level to be able to do the work that certainly that I enjoy doing, and that I think benefits general awareness of the Scots text that we've got. So that's one thing I'd like to possibly discuss. And also on the literary side, something that I come across very frequently is that all our historic texts in Scots, once we post them up or we make them available digitally, people seem to accept that and without question the validity, the cultural significance of that. But once we see on social media any kind of contemporary use of Scots or any contemporary written use of Scots, then it's a gibberish, it's made up language. So I'm just wondering how we can bridge that gap between accepting the language as a normal language to be proud of, because that's very much what I see it as, and possibly coming from the outside, I can maybe appreciate that more. I just don't know where that sits, but that's kind of what I'd like to possibly look into tonight.
Thank you, Alice. That's great. Next speaker is Professor McColl Millar.
Thank you, Jeremy. Right, I could talk about the fact that I've spent the last 20 years of my working life thinking about Scots primarily and analysing it in various ways, both historical and contemporary. I could plug my most recent book, which came out about a month ago, Modern Scots, an Analytical Description or something like that. As they say, buy it, buy something else, don't buy anything. Right there, but I think the important thing to say as well, maybe more important, maybe is I'm a native speaker of Kintra dialect of West Central Scots as well. It's visceral for me. This, it's not something that's just an academic pursuit. Now I'm going to bend your ears very quickly about lexis, about vocabulary, because I think that's a central important thing that we need to talk about in many ways. Scots is differentiated in a variety of different ways from other varieties. This is phonological, obviously it sounds different, the different varieties sound different from each other, but also markedly different from any variety of English. Without raining on Jennifer's parade or whatever, morphosyntactically in terms of its structure, its grammar, although to a lesser extent. That. But the thing that really marks off Scots, particularly when you speak to Scots speakers, is the vocabulary. It's the words that you use. Right? I think it was Henri Gide, I'm probably wrong about this, but I think it was Henri Gide who said that in the end, all patriotism is a wish to return to the food of your childhood. Right? Now, I don't think I'd like to go back to mince and totties and things like that. But when it comes to the words, you know, that come to me again, and I haven't thought of them for 20 years because I haven't lived where I come from for 30. It's part of that there. And the issue is, I think, that as we speak, fewer and fewer specifically Scots lexical items and phrases are being used, right? This is not in literary terms, this is real life. Now, some of this would have gone anyway. Some of it would have gone because the fishing went and farming changed so very much. My part of Scotland, coal mining went. These all affected it. But it's other everyday words about weather and about emotions and so on, which you get people saying, oh, I haven't heard that in X. And in some ways, that's nice because you've made somebody's day. But it's not actually great for the language itself. The issue, I think, is, and I'm going to bang the drum here, the issue, I think, is that while we have excellent dictionary-like material, and we've got the representative, in fact, the boss over there, here, with them, I think it has to go further than that. Almost 70 years ago, Edinburgh University undertook to do a linguistic survey of Scotland, right, which was, for its time, state-of-the-art and most interesting. But things have changed so much since then that it's become a historical document. What I would like to call for is a linguistic survey of Scots from Unst all the way to Donegal, where lexis would be looked at as a separate item, but across age groups as well. What do people actually know? And what do they use? Because there's lots of words I know that I've never used. Verfochen, for instance, good word. My mother used it regularly. My daughter won't ever hear it. That's just the way it is. So we want to understand that. That's also, it has a very strong academic input into it, but it's also important to understand what's actually happening when we're actually talking about Scots. What is going on with that before we start making big policy decisions, which might just be a tremendous waste of money or time with that. That's my soapbox.
Thank you very much, Robert. And Jennifer.
Thanks, Jeremy. So as Jeremy said, I work at the University of Glasgow and I work on varieties of Scots, and I work particularly on how Scots varieties are changing in the here and now. You can go back 500 years and see how they've changed, but I'm looking at change and in the here and now. And one of the things I'm interested in is how Scots is transmitted through the generations. So one of my research projects has been looking at how parents talk to their kids, to their preschool kids, and in particular how mothers talk to the preschool kids. Do they talk to them in more a Scottish standard English, in their posh voice, or do they talk more in the variety of Scots where they're from? The answer is they do both. There's a spoiler alert. I'm also interested in the idea of the Scots linguistic continuum. So in Scotland, what you find is we have many different voices. So at the moment, I'm using my quite posh standard Scottish English voice, and I'm wearing my suit. I'm quite dressed up. Tomorrow, I might be wearing my sparkly boob tube and speaking like I speak when I go home to the northeast of Scotland. So I'm interested in this, how we slide up and down this linguistic continuum that we have in Scots, and how much you can slide up and down. Can you move a little bit in that linguistic continuum, or can you move in a very large way? Really like two different languages you're using. And the third area of research that we've been doing most recently is the Scots Syntax Atlas. So what we've done is we've now gone to about 130 locations throughout Scotland, and we go through a questionnaire on the syntax, the grammar of Scots, not so much concentrating on the words, as Robert talked about, but on what we call in linguistics the syntax of Scots. So asking questions like, do you say, I'm going to bed? Or do you say, I'm going to my bed? Who says I'm going to my bed? A show of hands. Okay, who says I'm going to bed? Who has no clue what they say? Never thought about it. What about the carpet needs to be hoovered, or the carpet needs hoovered? Who says the carpet needs hoovered? Giving yourself away as Scots speakers there, okay? So we now have about 130 locations, and what we're going to be doing next year is launching the Scots Syntax Atlas, which will be a publicly available atlas that you can go on. We've also got lots and lots of recordings from all these places. We've looked at younger speakers, older speakers, and tracking change in the grammar of Scots across geographic space and across time. So what I'm really interested in is experiences of the Scots linguistic continuum and experience of Scots in the home, in those first years of language acquisition. When a child starts to learn the language, what are they exposed to from the primary caregiver? Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed to our speakers for kicking us off with some fascinating questions. One of the things that's always struck me as intriguing is the fact that language is a tool which we all share, but then of course we're all fiddling with it ourselves. So it's something that, because language is shared, it's therefore the kind of shared tool. I can always tell my wife has driven the car because something has happened to it, which I'm not quite sure about, but she's moved the chair. And in many ways, the thing about language is something, because it's a shared tool, we all have our engagement with it. That means that we're all having input to it. It's why it's so important to us all. Okay, well, I'm going to shut up because I've got nothing of interest to say on these matters. I'm going to turn to our panel, and I wonder if one of our panelists would like to maybe address some of the questions which they've raised. Who'd like to kick off in responding to some of those issues that have come up?
Well, it was interesting listening to Jennifer there. I don't think she knows this about me, that I have two bairns. Lily is 6 and Teddy is 5. And I speak Shetland Tatum a lot, but their mum doesn't. She's really more just an English speaker. And I see them then, they speak to me using a lot of Shetland words, but not their mum. And I see that going on in other, like with other family members. And something that I never noticed about myself, but people who I'm close to say, is that I speak my broadest Scots when I'm with my dad. So he's a very broad Shetland speaker, and he's very proud of that. And people say, "Oh, Bruce, I never hear you speak like that until I saw you with your dad the other day." So, but that to me is completely unconscious. So I don't know what you would respond to that, but that's my experience as both a son and a father.
Sure, yeah. So there's a whole load of things in there. That's the linguistic continuum we talked about. So how Bruce talks to his dad is maybe different to how you talk to your two kids, etc. And there's also that thing of transmission from parent to child and what people choose to do. And some people might look at it and think, because in my own research, what I've found is that caregivers, and it was mothers in this case, in conversation with their children, moved from more standard Scots to more broad. I should say I'm from North East Scotland, I'm from Buckie, if anybody kens it. So they would be speaking a bit like this to their child, and then they would start speaking it more like this. So there was definitely a movement in the two different varieties. And folk might say, well, that's a bit of a shame that they're not being fully exposed to North East Scots. But what the kids are actually getting in this case at this very young age is a very important linguistic tool, that ability to slide up and down the linguistic continuum. And what you find is that from a very young age, kids are little linguistic geniuses. Not only do they know how to put the words together into a proper order, into a proper sentence, for example, but they know that when they're playing, for example, they can say, "Oh, Mum, fit would you in the day?" But maybe when they're in a more teaching situation, it would be, "What are we doing today?" That means that then they know when someone out with the community comes and talks to them, they're not talking in North East, the child already knows at a very young age that they can talk in this slightly different form of Scots to that other person. So in fact, they're getting a very important linguistic tool there right from the beginning of language acquisition.
I think actually, just thinking about that there, my mother almost totally spoke Scots. She was not aware she was speaking Scots. There was no decision to do that. But except when she was really, really angry, in that kind of cold white anger, where you're reasoning, because I do the same. If somebody's really annoyed me, I speak in almost exaggerated standard English way to say you are nothing to me. So it cuts both ways.
Exactly.
Where sits our southern dame gathering her brows like gathering storm.
Indeed. Yes.
Well, yeah, I had a kind of experience that parallels in some way Bruce's one, because my mother was a Shetlander, but she didn't speak Shetland dialect unless she was on the phone or if she was in Shetland. So one of the big treats of our childhood was to get my mother to speak Shetland to us. So it was a massively exciting moment if she went on the phone and we'd all sit round listening to her speaking Shetland. And it was a lovely thing. And I think I learned a lot just in that process of listening to her on the phone. We would repeat things that she would say. So when she came off the phone, we would say things that she had said back to her. But she sang us Shetland songs when we were kids. So we learned quite complex Shetland grammar. There was famous ones about Ging Hame with the Lowry and things like this, were fantastic songs for us. But the other place that I remember learning, consciously as a child learning, and I don't know if this is a normal thing for children to think consciously about the process of learning language, was when I stayed in Lerwick when I was a child on holiday, and I used to practice going to the shop. In my mind, I would use Shetland words so that when I went to the butcher for the biling beef and a bean, I didn't know if that's Shetland or if that's North East, but my granny would say, "Going down to the butcher and get a biling beef and a bean," and I would say, "Biling beef and a bean, a biling beef and a bean." We'd go ready to go into the butcher and say, "A biling beef and a bean," and see what the reaction was. And so I think some children are also learning consciously, and I don't know how that works. But then I was in a funny situation at home, because although my mother was a very strong Scots speaker, she'd made a strong effort not to speak Scots when she moved to the mainland. And my father didn't speak Scots at all. But we lived in a Scots-speaking world because we grew up in Aberdeen, and you were surrounded by the language that Jennifer and I can both speak to one another in. So I think this question of continuums and sliding up and down, and then at different stages consciously thinking about your language is also an important one, because I do think that many people think, what am I speaking and why am I speaking like this, and can I adjust my speech and should I adjust my speech? There's many discussions go on, I think, in the Scots language world as well about authenticity. Is this person marking it up, or are they a real Scots speaker? Is this person proficient? Somebody said to me, you're a half Scots speaker, because you can speak Scots, but you didn't learn it for being a baby. So I think there's also a question there about, is it right to learn it? And how do you do that? So many, many questions arise through this. And the intergenerational transmission process is massively complex and varied, isn't it?
Definitely.
It's fascinating stuff. I'll give you my last anecdote, which was our daughter when she was little. And both my wife and I are West London urban sprawl. So they're very fancy. Sorry, yes. Both my wife and I are West London urban sprawl, which is nothing to be proud about. But our daughter, of course, went to school with all her little Scottish friends, you see. And we worked out she had two ways of saying no. There was no, and there was no. No was what she got from Elaine and me, and no was what she got from her friends. And we also worked out, fascinatingly, that these two words were different in meaning. No was more emphatic than no. And I've used that to my students for years as an example of illustrating the great Leonard Bloomfield's notion that true synonymy doesn't really exist. We hear words in different circumstances, and therefore we give them different meanings. So she had to have a vocabulary of two. Now, of course, she says no. She doesn't want to sound like us.
One thing I'd like to talk about is what Bruce mentioned, which is the different names that people use for Scots in different places, and whether this really matters. Because the thing is, it's not just the North East, and it's not just Shetland and Orkney and Caithness or whatever. People from Glasgow speak Glasgow. I don't know what people from Paisley speak, but it's no Glasgow. I don't know.
Paisley.
Body. There. But, we've all got that. In fact, Doric is actually found in Roxburghshire. It used to be found all over Scotland, and it's just kind of retreated. And Roxburghshire dialect is very distinctive as well, with its thries and mais and things like that. So it may be because of that. I'm always in two minds about this. I thought the organisation Michael was referring to, the North East Language Board, the North East Scots Language Board, which I'm on. I fought long and hard for that not to be called the Doric Language Board, because there are ideological associations with that I don't necessarily like. We were talking about this earlier, in fact. It's also because it's associated with the past. It's let's get a good bit of Doric, and it's always like, bothy ballads and things like that, which is great, but it doesn't make people speak the language. It makes people learn songs.
I think it does matter. I don't know if that's working. There is a difference, I think, Robert, between places where people are self-consciously aware of some other form of language, like Shetland, the North East Aberdeen, and Orkney, where they've got a name for this thing. I think that naming the thing does change the way people think about it. And I say this as somebody who lives in West Lothian, but comes from Aberdeen. And I think in West Lothian, where the language is just as dense and rich as it can be in the North East, the fact that people don't have a name for it, I think is disabling in some sort of way. And I've been having this massive ongoing bathroom renovation in my house at the moment. And the plumber was in today, and he said to my partner, who'd come home from for lunch to do something in the house, is that you loused? And my partner Graham is absolutely never he listens to anything, and he was like, what? And the boy said, are you finished for lunch? And North East people, I know, would be thinking, louse is a proper Doric word and nobody else in Scotland kens it. But then some person in West Lothian is using it completely naturally, and they're not some ancient old relic of some linguistic past. And I wonder about, when you ask people in West Lothian and probably in Renfrewshire and wherever else, what is this thing that's coming out of your mouth? Most people don't have a name for it. But in Aberdeen or Buckie, if you ask people, what's this thing coming out of your mouth, they do know what it's called, and the same in Lerwick. So I'm wondering about, and I do think that that has an impact on the way people think of themselves and the level of self-consciousness about their linguistic identity too.
I'd like to just ask the question, Jennifer. That kind of reminds me of projects that we've done with schools where sometimes you get young people or children with first, second, third languages. Scots is one of them. And have you done any kind of, have you gauged that kind of take-up and where they're getting that, any of their languages from?
No, not directly, but one of the things, thinking about what's being said here, one of the things I do in the first year class, English language and linguistics class at Glasgow, is there's about 300 students in the room. It's a big class. So I say to them, who here speaks Scots? Now, from that 300, you have about 8 hands, and they're a bit like not quite up and then down, etc. Now, we know that the cohort of students in Glasgow the majority are Scots. They're from Scotland. So I say, okay, so who's from Scotland? And then maybe about 70% put up their hand, who was born and bred in Scotland. So I say to them, okay, what are you guys speaking? And they say, not Scots. So I said, okay, have you ever been in a situation where you're not in Scotland, you're in London or wherever, and someone will say to you, are you Scottish? And they say, yeah. And I say, how do they know you're Scottish if you're not speaking Scots? You are speaking Scots. So again, there's almost a disenfranchisement. If you're not speaking Doric or Shetland or something, you're not speaking Scots.
But even within the North East, I do something similar with mine, or I did, which is I'm getting them to tell me what is grammatically incorrect. Okay, so one of the examples I use is that boys are bigger than this boys. Right. To those of you who aren't used to it, in the north of Scotland and also in Orkney and Shetland, there is no plural expressed for that and this. Right. Possibly a gallant.
And that's the right form.
Yes.
I'd like to point
That's true.
So I say, who says this? And everybody's worried because they just got out of secondary school, most of them. They're going, nobody wants to say, it's me, there's something wrong. So but 2 people put their hands up. Quite often it turns out they don't. But then I say, who comes from the northeast of Scotland, Caithness, Orkney or Shetland? Fair number of hands go up. Right, let's try it again. Who says that boys are bigger than this boys? All of them go up. Because it's like, oh, they've got it. So that's even within Doric. There is that kind of disconnect. It really does depend, and Bruce is better at this than me, it really does depend who your teacher is. Mm-hmm. Sad but true. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, just to carry on this sort of anecdote, one of the jobs that I do as part of my job is I speak to the teachers who are at university training to become teachers, and I sort of open with what I opened with today and say I'm a very proud Scots speaker, and Shetland dialect is a huge part of my life and something that I'm very proud of, and I open with that, and then I say, who here speaks Scots or any form of Scots? And it's like one person. And then I go through the whole 2-hour lecture of how great Scots is and how beneficial it'll be to the learners that they'll go on to teach. And by the end, half the class are saying, yes, I speak Scots. But the idea that it is something to be valued is a big hurdle. It's for so many people, I'd say, particularly Dundee and Glasgow sort of areas, they are almost a little embarrassed that they can speak Scots, which is a vast contrast to what I experience in Shetland, where Shetland dialect is more sacred than religion. You know, we're a very
too sacred.
Too sacred, yes, yeah. It is. But it's odd for me when I come across that, and I think what we've just spoken about in the last couple of minutes is that as a nation and as the Scottish population today, we are not proud of our linguistic heritage. We are not, we celebrate it in our own home, but we don't celebrate it maybe with people who we meet in our day jobs, and as a result, the language does suffer. And I actually think that we do need to open our arms to new Scots speakers. That you should be allowed, as someone who comes to live in Shetland, should be allowed to learn Shetland dialect and use the words. And someone who's living in Glasgow and working with Glaswegian speakers should learn Glaswegian words and speak Glaswegian. And I think it was Michael who said, are you a born Scots speaker or are you a Scots learner? Well, I think you should be proud to be either. And right now we're not a country, and Shetland's definitely not a place where it is seen as a acceptable thing to learn our dialect, to use our words if you are a newcomer to the island. And so I think Shetland is a really extreme case in that sense, and I think it's something that really does have to change for Shetland dialect and Scots language to survive, is that people need to be encouraged to learn it and to use it.
And would you see the national institutions being part of that, like the National Library? It's the remit is there. The texts certainly are there for researchers, but we're trying also to open that up to obviously the younger students. So do you see that as being we need something like a Scots language policy to be adopted by?
I think that there's a sociology element that I am not going to be able to succinctly sum up or in any way eloquently, but people need to change how they think. And we, as the present generation, as speakers, need to change our approach to the person who lives next door and the people who live in our street and the people who we share this country with. I think we need to be more accepting of each other and newcomers, and we should want to share our language that is indigenous and unique to this country.
Well, can I ask a very quick question, just all the panelists to think about? It's traditional to say that all languages change. The only languages that don't change are dead ones. And one of the things that's always struck me about, especially living in Glasgow, as I have done for the last, God help me, almost 40 years, is that Glaswegian has changed. It hasn't stopped being productive. It's producing new forms, new phenomena all the time. And that for me is exciting because it suggests that that's the kind of value that we have about it. And I wonder, if a language is living and it's changing, then is it something that we want to celebrate that change, or do we want to sort of say, well, no, I want to restrain ourselves from change in the ways in which when you're developing, you're thinking about these matters?
I think the issue is this, that a lot of what is happening isn't so much Scots internal as to do with a merging of colloquial English with Scots. Now, I can stand here and go on about that forever. It probably won't make any difference. But so long as this is happening, so long as this large-scale contact is taking place, first with the middle classes and then in urban centres as well, I would say, but it's everywhere, there's no doubt about that. You'll get into interesting situations. I'm aware of this happening in Aberdeen. I've lived there long enough, well over 20 years now, to hear this. The University of Aberdeen, unusually for a Scottish university, isn't in the leafy parts of town. It's actually quite mean streets round about, insofar as Aberdeen has mean streets. Right. So you hear working class Toonserspick, Aberdeen, spoken all the time by kids passing through to school and various other people moving about. What strikes me is a number of things. One of them is that apart from sort of a few stereotypical northeast features like where becoming fe and stain being steen and things like that, it actually sounds remarkably west of Scotland at times, which is not surprising given that, when we think about the oil boom, we tend to think about the middle class people that moved up, but a lot of people came from working class west of Scotland because trades like shipbuilding and so on were going, and then you could work in the oil industry. So they're around as well. But the other thing is that it's just these token things, a few words, a token pronunciation. It's not standard English, but it's something new. Now, we can celebrate that. We probably will in 100 years' time, maybe. But it is different, and I'm not sure that's Scots. But then again, who am I to tell anybody what to do? You know, carry on. As you say, you might as well argue with God as try to stop change. Yes.
Well, just again, to use a personal example of what Robert's just said, whilst I may sit in Edinburgh and be able to say I speak Shetland and I'm really good at speaking the way that I do when I'm at home, and it maybe seems like I'm a good Scots speaker, but anyone of about the age of 70 in Shetland will not regard me as a good Shetland speaker at all, and I mispronunciate and have an anglicised accent, and I've watched too much TV to possibly be a good Shetland speaker, and there's I'm not exactly sure what your view is there, Robert, but
I don't have any views.
No, but I think that that can be a real, in my job, promoting it in education, that can be a real hurdle. The idea that the 3-year-old, 7-year-old, 17-year-old is in some way wrong, which of course is a big problem that Scots has faced for hundreds of years, is that it's not English. And now, and well, every generation will have, but another problem that exists today is that the modern and young Scots speaker is simply, repeating what they have heard, is not only not speaking English, but is also not speaking good Scots.
Yeah, and of course it was ever thus. So a Chesterfield is better than an IKEA sofa. We always think old is better, new is not so good. And you can bet that 100 years ago, people were saying, young people these days, they're not speaking the proper Scots or whatever. So it's not just applied to language. No. It's we have this view that old is good, new is bad, and I think it's really reflecting that.
They are a generation of vipers. Yes. But I think what is worrying is that, yes, that's true, and it will always be true. Everybody always thinks there, is the fact that there may be a cut-off, which is, I believe, I'm seeing Wilson sitting there, but with Gaelic in particular, this is an issue because younger Gaelic speakers may not be entirely speaking Gaelic all the time. They may be slightly semi-speakerish, and at times people don't want to speak Gaelic with them, the elders, because they are deforming the language. Now, Scots is different because Scots and English are such close relatives that it's less obvious. But it's there, and there's no doubt about that. That's what, one of the reasons why I'm saying, let's understand lexical use, let's understand what people are doing, rather than be anecdotal about it.
I think it's quite difficult. Sorry.
No, go
Jennifer,
on.
do you want to say?
No, go on.
Well, I think this question of changes is quite a hard one to unpick because, of course, there's change happening, and but there's not a huge amount of data about how that change is happening and what the change involves, and that's due probably to many years of neglect of Scots at academic institutions, not accepting the work that you have been doing over years, but there's been a lot of time when data hasn't been collected and there hasn't been much investigation into this process. So it's hard really to move beyond anecdote. But there is no doubt that lots of people are using Scots words a lot. And, you can go to any social media platform and people who live in Scotland will be talking to each other using lots of Scots words. And that'll be realised at different levels and to different degrees. And some of it, most of it is unconscious, of course. If most people aren't Scots language enthusiasts, and most people aren't Scots language campaigners, and they're not going to specific sites where they'll exchange messages with one another where they talk about screeving to the minister and stuff like this. But they will be talking about football and stock car racing and knitting and goodness knows whatever else in their own tongues, in some form of that. So so it is there. The questions are really about the extent to which that's happening and the extent to which it's different from how it might have been 30 years ago. And in my own experience, I kind of learned Shetland dialect in the 70s, and in those days there wasn't a TV. There was only one channel available when I used to go up, and it was black and white, and it was BBC One, and it was only on for about 3 hours a day. So I suppose you had to talk more at that point than when Bruce was a youngeen in Shetland. But this question about change, I think, is a very important one, Jeremy. But there's so little, I think, in terms of data that really allows us to talk in an informed way about it, that really most of us have to resort to anecdote.
I forgot what I was going to say now. Yeah, I think the idea of, so it's going back to what Bruce said about people not feeling proud. And I think it's much more complicated than that. So if you step out in the streets of Glasgow, what do you hear? Glaswegian, distinctly Glaswegian. But Glaswegians don't talk about like you hear about the Doric, this mythologized Doric, etc. It's just something they do. And really, when you know, like I say, step out in the streets of Glasgow, it's a very distinctive variety. You hear it all around you. And definitely, as Jeremy said, it's changing, but it's still distinctly Glaswegian. But it's not a thing for them. And I think it goes back to Michael's point about the naming of it. And also, of course, the talking of it about it as well. Most people don't sit around like we're doing tonight discussing varieties of Scots and whether it's dying or not. It's just something they do. So I think it's much more complicated than that. And even though people aren't saying overtly, I'm proud of my variety, I'm proud of Scots, it doesn't mean they're not. Because often those things are covert and under the surface.
And saying I'm proud of being a Shetland speaker or a North East speaker is often about saying I'm proud to be Fey, North East or Shetland. And the assertion of a distinct regional identity through the naming of language, I think, is another sociolinguistic phenomenon, which also complicates further the question of how people think of themselves linguistically. Because some places people couldn't care less about asserting their regional identity in that way. But in some places it's very, very important to do it. And you and I know as Northeasters that asserting your identity as a Northeast person is extremely important. And you spend a lot of time doing it. And lots of people spend a lot of time doing it. So naming your language is a way to realise that. So yeah, I think it's there more and more and layers of sociolinguistic questions that this subject raises.
I think the thing is that I'm always slightly suspicious for people who talk about being proud of the way they speak, because if you're a French speaker, you're trained to say that, but you don't actually necessarily think that, because why would you? You just speak French. You know, it's not. I mean, yes, you're taught to think it's superior and obviously more logical than all other speech forms, etc. But the problem is when you get this sort of Doric label and things like that, is that it puts off as many people as it attracts. Because people think this is a problem that all language planners, all language activists have, is the fact they're seen as cranks. Because let's be honest, folks, quite often they are. But I mean, I'm one myself, you know. But it isn't healthy to be a monomaniac, right? But that's what you have to be, and we need people like that. But it can get a bit over the top. You know?
I think this is a moment where we're going to start in a second or two to move on to the floor. Michael was nudging me to say, "Look, I think some of the people in here are looking a bit restive," and I think that's a good point. I was talking to a friend of mine from the BBC the other day. And I said, where do you get your letters of complaint? What do you get them about? Is it things like nudity or violence? No, nudity, not a problem. Bring it on. Violence, love it. Bad language. That's what really gets people down. And I think it's because it's your possession as well as anyone else's. So it's like someone's coming into your room and shouting at you. And yeah, obviously we do use bad language occasionally. I've been known to use it when talking about the behaviour of other road users. But I tend to use it there, and I wouldn't do it elsewhere. And that's maybe the problem with social media. but that's opening yet another can of worms, which Michael already did. I think this is the moment where I believe we have folks with wandering. Ah, yes, here they come. Look at that. Okay, there you go. We have some wandering mics here. Look at that. They came in just like that. Does anyone would like to comment on anything? Or yes, there's a hand gone straight up like that. Brilliant. Thank you.
Hiya. So I was interested, Bruce, that you were talking about in education. And obviously there's now the SQA qualifications that you can do in Scots, and there's a few schools doing that. And when I talk with folk who are minority language speakers in other countries, they're amazed to find out that you can't do like an evening class in Scots in Scotland, that you can go to Kinross College and do Italian, but you can't do Scots. But obviously variation in Scots, which is one of the sort of, as you would say, hurdles to that, because can you only in Kinross teach a Kinross Scots, and how does that work? So what do you think best practice looks like for that? Because I think there is a desire for it, and I think if folk were able to learn it as a hobby, then folk that did speak it would feel more proud of it, because like suddenly you've got this thing that folk want, and also there would be less of that. If you're speaking it to me and you're not a native speaker, you must be taking the piss.
Yeah, probably because I'm from Shetland, and Shetland is the most distinct variation of Scots. I say authoritatively. Right?
Probably.
Yeah. Then I am of the view that the variations, the regional varieties, the dialects, whatever label you want to apply, the different languages of Scots language, they are of immense importance. I did some work with James Robertson about, translating children's books like The Gruffalo, and a Scots version. Well, how about a Shetland version, a Glasgow version, a Dundee version? And my experience of working just in Shetland or working in the borders is that the learner, the child, responds best to the language that they hear others using around them. So whether it's the 5-year-old boy who hears their dad speak it, or the 15-year-old girl who knows that the people in the next village speak that, then I promote the use of the variations to the nth degree. I think that is of immense importance, as opposed to an idea of Scots language. But the drawback with that is I think that it makes it a lot more complicated, and it doesn't have the sort of appeal of we're promoting this language, whereas you're suddenly promoting something that's far more parochial. But just like I'm an odd, proud Shetland dialect speaker, I'm also very proud to be very parochial. So,
well, I think actually also adding on to that as well is that rather than the night school things, which I think are a good thing, certainly up where I work and live, different organisations run courses for people from elsewhere. I can remember a friend of mine actually was running a course on local Scots for the buses. Because a great many, it was just when there was a big post-2004 influx of people from East Central and Eastern Europe. And that was very successful. I know that Grampian NHS does exactly the same thing because a great many nurses are coming from the Philippines and so on, and need to understand what people are saying to them. This is important. So, it would be possible to roll that out. But I think Bruce is right in saying that in the first instance anyway, it has to be in the local dialect. Because what use is it for a bus driver from Lithuania to learn Shetland? Really, in Aberdeen.
If he's in Aberdeen, but if he's in Lerwick.
Well, no. I underqualified that. But I think that could be rolled out. And it's got to remember that, unlike some other languages like Gaelic or Norwegian or Italian, the dialects of Scots aren't that different from each other, apart from maybe Shetland. Yeah. But they're mutually intelligible to a high degree.
There's a question there, and then there, and then there. So, Thomas there first. There you go. He got his hand up first. Sorry about that, guys.
Yes, another question about more or less the same topic. As you probably can hear, I'm not Scottish. I arrived in 2002. And one thing I noticed was, first of all, there was no courses. That's one thing. But also, at first I heard no Scots, I thought. What was happening was that people mumbling a lot. It was really hard to understand them. But every time they said we had words, say, football. What were they saying? And if I asked them, they then repeated very clearly, football. So it was like Scots was only ever mumbled. Every time as a foreigner you ask people to enunciate a bit better, they translate it into English effectively. And that makes it extremely difficult as a foreigner to actually pick up any Scots, because you can't really pick up those mumbled words. The only time it actually changed was when I was in the Northeast at some point, because Doric speakers seem to be very willing to enunciate Scots clearly. But in the Glasgow area, they just translate into English every time you do something, and it's making it immensely difficult to pick anything up. But at the same time, it's only when you actually learn Scots that you actually start understanding exactly what people are saying on the streets of Glasgow. So it's a very difficult situation where you need to learn a language in order to understand people, but they're not willing to teach a language to you. So it's a complex chicken and egg problem, and I'd be interested in your comments.
We might pick up a few more from the audience, if that's okay, and then go on. Now, I think who else was, there was one there, and then that lady there, and then that gentleman there. So lady in white, Joanne.
Thank you very much. Yes, as a foreigner as well, I would like to reiterate the point about the provision in Scots and the opportunities to learn Scots. That would be very welcome. But I would like to come back to Jennifer's point as well about the continuum and sliding up and down. And why is Scots always down? Because this is the kind of conceptualization that people very often have in their minds, that, you know, whenever you want to go up on that continuum in terms of formality levels and registers and that sort of thing, you always go up to the Scottish Standard English region, rather than treating Scots as your kind of formal or more prestigious way of speaking. So the Scots in many people's minds is always down, isn't it? And then when we go back to the fact how parents, maneuver between these different ways of talking to children, but then in a way perpetuate the same idea and the same interpretation of where Scots actually belongs, that it belongs in the playground, that it belongs at home. But when you go out, when you go to your workplace, when you go to your educational setting, you're no longer allowed to speak Scots, or you're no longer sort of validated in doing that. So I would be interested to hear what you think about these attitudes and these perceptions.
I think the Scots linguistic continuum, it's something that people interested in Scots talk about. The man on the street, the person on the street wouldn't know about that, but certainly when you see that represented, it's horizontal, it's not vertical, and that's an important point. And the other important point about this is that's not something specific to Scots. This is what you find in many, many varieties of English, or in fact any other language. So Creoles, for example, where you get your acrolect closest to the standard, and baselect are very, very different from mainstream norms. It's not something specific to Scots. I think that's an important point.
And I would just like to fly the flag for the National Library of Scotland, that we are trying to give it a national platform and elevate, certainly in for the texts, to give people ownership and to point to this breadth and depth and the richness that's in the written format, just to kind of start that misconception, chipping away at it.
I think a point about workplaces, because this notion that the language has to be contained within certain spaces is always conceptualised in the sense that Scots language can be spoken here in this domestic, friendly, couthy, cosy environment, but it can't be spoken here in this workplace. But it's the conceptualisation of the workplace that I find really a bit troubling here, because the conceptualisation of the workplace, I think, is a university department or something. because many people who work don't work in those kind of places where there is that type of linguistic prejudice, or there may be another form of linguistic prejudice, because you certainly can't speak SSE in the form you might find at Edinburgh University if you work in Tesco and Bowness, which is where I do my shopping, or Lidl and Bowness, where I also shop. Nor would it be feasible, because my partner owns a body repair shop in Grangemouth in the industrial estate, and it would be really unusual if somebody came along there applying for a job and spoke like I'm speaking now, or like Jeremy, despite being a common person from West London, speaks. So the notion of a workplace, I think, is quite restrictive when people talk about it in those terms. Workplaces are all sorts of places. They're not just standard life. It's not just a call centre in Edinburgh. It can be all kinds of places, and many workplaces are absolutely the heartland of Scots-speaking Scotland. Right across the Central Belt, for example, and all over the North East and these places. Nurses, shop workers, solicitors, farmers are speaking Scots at work. And the notion that you wouldn't speak Scots to those people at work is the odd one, really.
And prejudice goes either way. So in my hometown, if you spoke Scottish Standard English, you'd be laughed out the tune, or beaten up. Or something.
So folks would think there was something wrong with you if you spoke like
we get. I'm from actually somewhere called Staines, which I understand is massive. However, and when I go to Staines, if I spoke like I'm speaking now, then I really would take a bad time. Now there was a lady just there, and then the gentleman in blue, and then this lady here in orange. There we go. So here we go.
So there's an overarching theme here about unity, a desire to unify the Scots language, to elevate the identity of Scots and Scots speakers, and yet there are these disparate languages. And I think it's interesting that we've been so quickly dismissive of the French, in particular the Académie Française. They are the pioneers, the French, they are the leaders in the world of preserving a language, unifying a language. And I believe there's a lot to be learned from the French in this discussion. So I'd be keen to understand what what the panel's view is of the French example of how to preserve language.
The thing is, the French example isn't particularly good. The Académie Française has very limited power. It's in fact, has no power. It's the Education Department of the Republic which has the full power, and often uses the Academy when it wants somebody to blame. Right? I was merely doing a bit of leg pulling about French, which I admire greatly, although maybe not quite in the way that regional languages have been treated in France. But I think some kind of language planning board would not be a bad thing, as long as people didn't get carried away. I think if done the right way, the one that Michael and I are both on, obviously in different ways, in the Northeast is a start, as long as it doesn't turn into a sort of separatist thing, but that's another matter. There's already one basically in Shetland. You know, Shetland Forwards is essentially a language planning organisation. So the Wills there, of course, in Ulster, it's very different. With this, by Ulster, I mean,
you shouldn't go there too far.
Well, but it's also, I mean, Ulster Scots is in that strange situation of being in one province, but in two nation states. So that makes work even more difficult. And I don't see them ever signing up to anything we would do. You know,
and language boards don't always work. I mean, there are many instances of language boards, and sorry, I've been coughing all night, so I'm having to eat Jeremy's sweets. But language boards sometimes don't work. You know, there's a famous incident of a language board set up in Galicia to try to regulate Galician. And Galician is in the public sphere, so you can hear it on TV and whatever, and the board advises TV presenters and whatever how to speak. But people in the street don't speak like the language boards speak, and they don't speak like folk on the telly speak, so a bit like us. I mean, I've never heard a real person speak like Jackie Bird, but the difficulty with the people on the street is most of them are speaking a mixture of Gallego and and Castilian, like we're mostly speaking some kind of mixture of Scots and English, or many people are speaking that. The problem with the people who are speaking this mixture of Gallego and Castilian is when the board is saying you've got to speak like that, it's just another institution saying to people you can't speak properly. And so the difficulty is those people become confused even further about whether their language is valid. And so I think it's got to be, I'm not saying there's nothing, that language boards are always invalid, but I'm saying language boards themselves don't always solve all the problems.
No, there's clearly a difference between the language that the Académie Française preserves and the different dialects that they speak across the whole of France. But the fact is that they have identified one unified language that is French, comprised of all those languages. So my point is just about, do we identify Scots as a language that needs unified? My other question is about the engagement with the arts. What authors are you engaging with in terms of standardising, authors that are writing, screenwriters that are writing in Scots and different variations of that, and is it possible to influence and engage with that side of things?
I'm conscious that there's a very patient man there, but I think I'm going to pick that one up in a second. That gentleman there in the blue shirt, who's right in the middle, so you have to do a bit of passing down.
Does the panel not think that the bigger problem for Scots is no the spoken Scots, but the fact that we can't read or write our own language? You know, most of us in the streets speak Scots, but give us a book and we read it like a 10-year-old with our finger on the page and get them to write Scots, and they can't. That's the bigger problem. So I think we need to start educating kids to read and write in Scots, and then we can solve the problem of speaking Scots and not being ashamed of speaking Scots. I just want to know what you think.
I suppose we privilege the written word, but if you look across the world, we're in the minority. The fact that we can read and write, that we're literate, that's not the important thing. I think the important thing is the spoken word. We have this thing in the West of we privilege the written word as though it's the right thing, but actually the spoken word is right. And the second point is, I think, in terms of representation of Scots in writing, that's happening right here and now from the ground up, and that's in social media. So if you look at Facebook posts, for example, I'm astounded at the level of linguistic detail that's coming out in people in my hometown writing on Facebook. I'm like, I thought I only knew about that as a linguist. So, at man ears negan, representation of that at instead of that, etc. Really, really quite astonishing things. So you're seeing now representation of writing, but importantly, it's from the ground up.
Maybe it's changed since I was at school. Are they teaching Scots reading and writing school now?
Well, not really. I mean, Bruce would know better than anybody else, but
I think that I've changed my view on this learning to read and write thing. I kind of agree with what Jennifer says a lot of the time. I was at a meeting in Aberdeen recently and people were talking about it, and I've always had the same position, which is that spoken word is the most important thing. You've got to have intergenerational transmission of spoken Scots. So the best way to keep this language alive for the future is to have people hearing it in public space. And for younger people, particularly, to hear it so that it keeps moving into the next generation. But I was persuaded by an argument somebody there made that really this process of learning to read and write is massively empowering. Now, I understand that there's a base level educational argument about why reading and writing is good. But I think with minority languages, you have to think about what's your priority? How do you make this thing keep living? And what is the most likely route to keep it alive? And I think that there are many persuasive sociolinguistic arguments that the best way to keep a language alive is to keep people speaking it and to encourage spoken Scots in the way that Jennifer speaks. Jennifer argues, I think is the right one. I think there are many arguments in favour of reading and writing. But when we've had to make decisions as people who campaign for this language, who want it to keep living, who are passionate about it, who are the oddballs, who really think and talk about it all the time, we've had to think, well, what do you do to keep this thing alive? And mostly, I think, what we've agreed is the best way to keep it alive is to get people to speak it. And then when people come along like yourself and say, but what about reading and writing? We're like, oh no, we've got to admit that we haven't really made much progress with that. But we are making, I think, a little progress, and Bruce probably can speak about that more.
Well, I could just share a real example that I've seen recently. 2 different schools, one in Glasgow, one in Edinburgh, both learning, well, being taught the Scots language word that was mentioned earlier. So the children involved are generally about sort of 15. And the school in Glasgow, it was the lowest achieving pupils who were doing the class, who this award, which is lower than a higher, this would be one of the few qualifications they would get, and they were excelling in speaking, reading, writing Scots, that they were Scots speakers first before they were English speakers, and they were, same as people on Facebook, they were able to take the language that they used on the streets but had rarely seen written or been taught to write, and were able to codify it in such a way that it could be shared. And they did very well at this, and they had a lot of personal things to say. I also worked at a school in Edinburgh where the Scots Language Award was being offered as an extra challenge to pupils who were, A's across the board, and they were very much in that way that would be really good if everyone was. They were really keen to learn. They loved learning. They loved school. They did really well at school. And the Scots Language Award, simply because it's available, was something that was given as an extra challenge. And there was a lot of teenagers in that class who were writing Scots language, but they didn't speak it. They were simply using things like the dictionary and the Dictionary Schools app as a way of saying, I am learning the Scots word for home, hame. I am learning the Scots word for walk, not wander, but, I'm not going to go into specific examples, but a dander, yeah, whatever. They were learning a Scots that they could write, that they couldn't necessarily, well, they hadn't been brought up to speak. And I thought that was really interesting. And it showed the different types of people we have purely just right now in 2018 who are 15, living not that far away from each other, and the different ways that Scots and schools engage, and the two come together. So there's 2 really life examples from recent times.
That's wonderful and great. So it's a sense of empowerment, isn't it? I always think it's a good thing. Lady in orange, and then 2 at the back.
My question relates to the gentleman behind me question earlier. I'm from Glasgow, and I do correct myself in English when people ask me, what did you just say? And I wondered if you thought that's why we are losing some Scots words, because we're constantly correcting ourselves into English, so we just start using those English words. And how do you think we can raise the status of things like Glaswegian, which seems to be considered slang, as opposed to things like Doric and Shetland?
Well, I think taking the second one first, inevitably, I mean, of course, I don't know, but I suspect that 150 years of criticism, both by Scots language activists and by the mainstream in education and so on, would be a very difficult thing to fight back. Having said that, I'm not in Paisley very often, not since my parents died, and I was there a couple of months ago, and the people to me didn't sound like they were from Paisley. They sounded like they came from Glasgow. But the thing is, the Glaswegians don't sound like Glaswegians to me anymore either. This is if you've lived away from, and this is just its natural change. But here's the thing, why do Paisley folk sound like Glaswegians? Because there's a covert prestige to Glasgow, which is there. Now, I'm not saying that is necessarily the best way to transfer prefer a dialect or whatever, but it's a bit more complex than that. It always is with that sort of thing. It's, although, I mean, yes, I get depressed as well by all these people saying, oh, I'm really sorry about my diet, where I speak, I just speak slang, or whatever. And I was like, oh God, that's such a shame, because it's so beautiful as well. So I don't know what the answer to that is, apart from just keeping on pushing it. Or whatever. But the thing is that quite often, my experience, I mean, Bruce would know better than me, quite often the parents are more of a problem than the schools are about this, particularly in the cities.
But I think as well, the proof is in the pudding. Glaswegians still sound Glaswegian. Yeah. So this goes to Robert's covert prestige. Maybe overtly they're saying, oh, it sounds terrible, it's slang. There must be something going on. There must be a lot of covert prestige. Otherwise, if you don't like something, you stop doing it, right? There's something about it that has a lot of covert prestige. As for the words, we know in the history of languages that words change the fastest. The sounds, the phonology of a language, the sounds of a language change more slowly, and the grammar changes even more slowly still. But words are very transient. They're being pushed through the system all the time.
Yeah, even common words don't turn up very often sometimes, you know. I suppose it's that use it or lose it sometimes. I don't know what we do about that apart from try to work out what's happening.
Glasgow is a lively linguistic space. I mean, there's no question about it. You get out of the train and, you know, in wherever that place is, Queen Street, and it's, yeah, you're clearly where you are. And there's no question that there's a living dialect in Glasgow. Absolutely none whatsoever. So I think that sometimes there's always this thing, and Jennifer sort of referred to earlier as well, about this constant fear that the thing that was good in the past is now a bad thing in the present. And we're all kind of listening, if we're interested in this subject, and wondering, is this as good as it once was? But I think Glasgow really is the question about what Glasgow thinks about itself is one that probably needs further research, though. I mean, Glaswegian dialect speakers. I don't think the thing about this panel, I guess, is most of us don't really have answers to the questions. But discussing them helps you to get to a place where you can understand the question better.
There are 5, 6 more people. I think the gentleman in the brown jacket was first, just there. Yes, that's the one. And then there are strings of other people.
I think it's very important to, I'm a wee bit concerned to see this sort of, what appears to be a division opening up between the value of spoken Scots as opposed to the value of written or read Scots. And I think it's important that these two things do not get separated. The gentleman in the middle there made a very interesting point about reading and writing Scots. I've been involved for the last, goodness knows, 16, 17 years now with publishing books in Scots for young readers. And one of the things that we made an early decision on was we were not going to try to impose a standard form of written Scots on folk who were interested in reading in Scots, but that we would try to do it from building from the base up, from the Scots that children brought to school. And one of the really fascinating things was that although my colleague Matthew Fitt and myself, when we were producing books in Scots, we were using a sort of non-dialect kind of Scots, if you like, a fairly broad-based kind of Scots. But what you found was when you presented that in schools and started to get primary school bairns or secondary school bairns to read, first of all, they looked at it and they thought it was a foreign language because they had never had that exposure to it on the written page. But once you actually began to read out loud to them, then they took that on board and they would simply look at the text and they would read it in their own language with their own particular dialect variations, and it wasn't a problem for them. But it was like seeing light bulbs going on all over the shop because they had suddenly been given validation, the validation that written, printed Scots can do to people who've never actually seen their own language written down. And I think it's really important that we don't separate these two things out. I think they go together. Yes, I think it's crucial that Scots as a spoken language is encouraged and endorsed and all the rest of it. But one of the ways that you can do that and validate it is by demonstrating to folk that speak Scots that it is a real language by showing that it can also work on the printed page.
I have to echo that from the National Library of Scotland. I mean, we've 10 minutes up the road. There's a repository of the greatest repository of written Scots, and why would we not want to showcase that? There are 15th century texts that you can still read the neb and pick out the Scots words. I mean, for young children to see that, to get validated, and not just young children, but lifelong learners. I think, I will always defend the printed word Scots as being vitally important to the spoken Scots.
Can you read it? We struggle.
But just to even see the physical item, the digital physical item, and recognize some words. I mean, we're not there yet, but it's starting to kind of chip away at the.
I think there's about 5 other hands going on.
Let's hear them. Let's hear them.
Shall we hear the people?
Yeah.
Yes.
Gentleman with the glasses and the beard next. There. I'm sorry to give you these rather crude references.
That's fine.
And then the lady, that lady.
One point that's interesting that I guess I hadn't thought about that I always tell my students is that ideologies about what is intelligible versus unintelligible speech is exactly that, ideologies. An interesting point come out. But I have a question for the panel with respect to this issue that's come up with who has a place to learn and speak and, in my case, at some point perhaps research and write about Scots. Someone made a point that speaking Doric is to sort of show that you're Fay Aberdeen, and I never will be. I'm from Philadelphia, but I'm wondering, you're all academics and intellectuals, but also people, and how does it feel for somebody who is not brought up speaking Scots to write and try to speak and research these things?
I think I might be, as the only non-Scots person on the panel, I can probably give you a good answer to that. I mean, I don't try and pretend I can speak it or write it, but I genuinely do not have any issues reading it, and it's just in my head I'm speaking it. I just am able to enunciate it, but it's just something that I feel like it's a natural thing. And interestingly, that you asked that question about research and writing. We've just got funding from Creative Scotland to appoint another Scots Screever, which we had 2015, 2017. So they'll be immersed in the collections at the National Library of Scotland, doing research into the written Scots, and Rona hopefully we'll get your students to assist us in developing more content, and that all goes on to a website called We Windies. If you just Google that, you'll find a set of Windies that uses Scots text and interprets them, and that's also available in English. So we try and make it kind of easier for people, for non-Scots, to try and start dabbling into texts and getting interested in that way. So
there's a couple of anecdotal things as well, just so you'll forgive me. One of them is there used to be a woman lived near New Deer in Buchan. She's dead now, sadly. And I thought she was from round about there. She spoke the local dialect, but in fact, until she was 23, she'd lived in London. Right? She was a Cockney. The other one is my wife, who's from Luxembourg, and indeed speaks a fair bit of it, probably mainly from me, but also from things surrounding. But interesting, she found something interesting when she was, we were both working on things to do with Shetland dialect, was that people were happier speaking to her than they were to me, because she was a complete outsider, right? There was no suspicions of her, right? There was no backstory, right? So sometimes if you're kind of half speaking and not half speaking, you might get a stranger reaction than if you were just speaking English, in my own experience.
The lady with short hair there.
Would anyone like to say a little about the power of pop music as perhaps opposed to folk music?
To do with Scots? Or?
We're also trendy here.
We're not all folk, we care nothing about.
So do you mean the use of Scots in
As pop culture.
Oh, as pop culture, right.
A bit like social media. There's a new language and an old language, but it's respectabilised.
there's a huge, well, to be honest, I would say, yes, I would like to say something about it, because one of the issues, we at the organisation I work for, we try to encourage people to feel positive about this language. And we try to allow people to experience the cultural and creative breadth of production in this language. And it is quite, and through that process, what we want people to do is to leave thinking, this is a good thing, and this is about me, and this is about my community, and this is about contemporary society. Now, there is a big, huge gap when we try to do this. We do this online, and we promote material through social media platforms, mostly content from our website and content deliberately created for social media. But, you know, Welsh has a big contemporary music production. Frisian has it. Many other minoritized or minority languages have this contemporary element to the culture. And when we try to find that stuff, it's really quite tough to find it. And of course, it must tell you something. And that thing that it tells you is something that's not always good to hear or good to accept, which is that there's this space where it doesn't fit so easily. And there are questions about why it's absent. And its continuing absence causes problems in terms of, I think, demonstrating that this thing has contemporary vitality. So I think it's a perfectly legitimate question to ask, and it does make sense. But there are many other contemporary spaces, there are other spaces where arts and creativity happen, where Scots is very vital. And so it's not a completely bleak picture.
And actually, sorry, Jeremy, if I just can quickly say, and actually now in the indie music scene, it's become the default that you sing in Scots. There's been a huge rise in that, and that's happened very recently over the last sort of 10 years, well, sort of 15 years ago, starting with Arab Strap and then moving on from there. You're hearing them singing all the time in very distinctive Scots.
Now, I'm afraid there's one up. Yes, that lady there. You got your hand up first, so I think you're the winner. So that's Lee. That's it. There you go.
Yeah, I would just like to get back to this, how can we save a minority language? And I think everyone here has contributed quite valuable things. The fact that we need to read in a minority language that we want to save. We also, of course, need to have it spoken intensively. We have to encourage both of that. But what I think is a bit of a problem in education in Scotland is that there is no clear curriculum for Scots. I mean, you have to decide, do we want to be a language? If we want to be a language, or not just a dialect or an accumulation of dialects, then you have to have a curriculum for it. A language has to be learnable, it has to have clear rules, and it has to be taught in education. And most successfully that works if you actually take the strongest, most widely spoken dialect and you standardize it, and then you teach it. And I would also like, who actually pointed out what the French Academy did for French, because it did make French a teachable language, a language with clear rules, and you can see that in many, many other successful languages, it only happens that way. If you refuse rules, if you refuse teachability, you will not save this language.
Well, can I first start off by saying, okay, the Académie Française has very little to do with the standardisation of French. French was already standardised when it set up. What it tries to do is put brakes on things. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, largely because of other things. Now, this is not to do with Scots, but I personally do not like the idea of one dialect being treated as that for all. Now that might come to it, but I think we would walk before we run. Can I just use the example of Ulster Scots, right? After 20 years ago, after the Belfast Agreement, one of the deals was that Ulster Scots would have, I suppose, quasi-official status within both Northern Ireland and also in Donegal, in the Republic of Ireland. Now, when Ulster Scots was first printed, or when Scots was first printed in Ulster, it actually was detrimental because it was written by activists, some of whom weren't Ulster Scots activists, but in fact from Scotland. And it looks nothing like any dialect spoken now. And it put a lot of people off because it was like, if that's Ulster Scots, well, I don't use it now. Normally what happens when you get one dialect that acts for all, it tends to be either by it being the language of the capital city, the middle class of the capital city, like present-day Standard English is essentially London English, middle-class London English. Present-day Standard French is essentially that of the court of Versailles and the upper middle classes of Paris, right, 500, 600 years ago. Or you plan it. You do something like Norwegian Nynorsk in Norway, where you take chosen, what are seen as most genuine forms of the language, and you bring them together in a mixture. That has the difficulty of the fact that nobody's a native speaker, right? So it can put people off, big time, actually, it can put people off. So what do you do then? Well, I think we're not, whilst I wouldn't be against at all having a standard written form of Scots, I don't think we're there yet. I think what we need to do is make sure we have speakers before we make sure we got that. Because the thing is, there's a lot more fun, and I know people who do this, I've probably done it myself, it's a lot more fun to sit in your bedroom at night working out spelling systems. You know, it's the same as being into Star Trek or something like that. Let's be honest about it. You know, it does no harm, but don't kid yourself that you're actually doing it for any purpose. The problem lies in that is the fact that it then becomes associated with quite hardline views about purity. And I, for one, would rather have diversity within that linguistically.
I think that what Robert's saying is absolutely fair enough, but I think we also have to be open to every argument that comes our way, because I know through the years I've done this job, I don't know the answers, I really don't, and I'm searching for them all the time. And so when somebody comes, like you have, and said, well, this is what really needs to be done, I think, yes, we have to think about that seriously. I don't think we should dismiss what you're saying. And when somebody says the Académie Française has done this, I don't think we should dismiss that either. But I think all of us who are involved in this have been looking at examples, and we've been looking for answers, and we are trying to find them. And so nobody's closed on this, at least I'm not. I'm not closed-minded at all about any proposal. As far as language boards are concerned, and as far as successfully rescuing minority languages from decline is concerned, the problem is this: there are almost no successful examples. So when we sit here and try and think about how do we do this, and we look around the world, and we look at Romansh, where they standardised it and it failed, and we look at Gallego, where they standardised it and failed. When we look at Irish, where they've got an act and they've got millions of pounds backing them and it failed, then we don't easily find the answers that people are expecting us to come up with. So nobody here, I don't think, is sitting thinking, oh no, that's a stupid idea, that's a crazy idea, whatever. We're constantly hoping that somebody will come to us with the solution that we're looking for, that will enable us to make this project a success. So I'm very interested in hearing any view about this matter. And the difficulty always is, you hear another view and you think, well, maybe that's the right one, and maybe that's convincing. And I guess we try through the years, and we try in our various projects, and we try in our various research projects and whatever, to come up with solutions. And sometimes we succeed, and sometimes we don't. And in that sense, we're not different from anybody else who's involved in minority language politics and campaigning.
Okay, on that powerful point, which opens us up in all sorts of directions, I fear that we're going to have to call it a night tonight. We've overrun a wee bit, but I think it was such an interesting discussion we didn't want to stop. I've got one or two quick things to say. First of all, I want to emphasise the fact that outside there is a copy of CSD2 for sale in the foyer. I've been sent a ship from this one, so if you want to get hold of a Concise Scots Dictionary, it's out there. But above all, what I'd like to do is to thank, first of all, our speakers. And secondly, I'd like to thank our audience for being a fantastic audience. And I know there were several other hands that came up, especially towards the end. I'm very sorry. I hope this will just give you more to do. I'd like to thank the British Academy and the Philological Society as the event partners tonight. It's been a fantastic event, I think. And I'd also like to thank our genial hostess here in the Royal Society of Edinburgh and those fantastic people who look after us so well. So thank you very much for coming.